Welcome to the new video of NeuroPhilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The mirror that blinds. From the beginning of human thought, self-knowledge has been hailed as the noblest pursuit of the mind. Philosophers and psychologists alike, from Socrates' Know Thyself, to Freud's analysis of the unconscious, from Jung's symbolic psychology to Foucault's reflections on the self, all pointed toward the same radiant idea, that the key to authenticity and freedom lies within. To understand oneself, they said, is to be free. But Carl Gustav Jung, perhaps more than any of them, discovered the shadow hidden behind that noble ideal. He understood that there exists a silent threshold where introspection turns into obsession, where the light that should guide begins to blind. Beyond that point, the search for meaning becomes a spiral, pulling the soul inward until it cannot find its way back. What begins as a journey of liberation can end as a form of self-imprisonment. Jung knew this not as a theory but as a lived ordeal. In his own words, the unconscious was no serene garden where one might gather flowers of insight. It was a wild forest, dense and unpredictable, where every step deeper risked losing the path out. He warned that diving into the self without balance can lead to disorientation, even madness. What waits in the depths is not always truth. Sometimes, it is the abyss looking back. The danger of excessive self-knowledge begins quietly. It starts with the sincere wish to understand one's motives, fears, and patterns. But soon, the gaze that once sought clarity turns inward like a weapon. The individual starts to live more in analysis than in experience, more in concepts than in connection. Life itself becomes secondary to interpretation. The world feels distant, people become objects of study rather than companions in existence. Such a person might believe they are evolving, yet they are merely withdrawing. They begin to value symbols more than sensations, theories more than affection. The heart, once spontaneous, becomes an observer of its own beating. They may even feel superior, thinking themselves more conscious than those who just live, not realizing that they have simply built another ego, one dressed in the language of enlightenment. This is the paradox Jung saw unfolding, that the deeper one dives into the psyche, the more one risks mistaking introspection for transformation. The individual begins to mirror their own reflection endlessly, mistaking that reflection for the truth. But as Jung warned, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The task is not merely to know oneself but to survive the knowing, to emerge from it with balance, humility, and connection to life intact. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes moments when he nearly lost his sanity in the face of the images rising from his unconscious, figures that spoke, symbols that overwhelmed, dreams that blurred with waking life. He did not romanticize this confrontation, he feared it. He knew how easily a person could drown in their own depths. The unconscious, he wrote, is not an obedient servant of reason, it is a living power with its own rhythms and intentions. To wander into it without reverence is to walk through fire believing you will not burn. Yet in our modern culture, one obsessed with self-analysis, personality types, and spiritual optimization, many people wander precisely this way. They dissect their thoughts, label their shadows, interpret every dream, convinced that endless introspection equals growth. But in truth, they are mistaking dissection for understanding. Self-knowledge, when stripped of balance, can harden into a subtle form of narcissism, not the vanity of mirrors, but the vanity of meaning. The person becomes fascinated with their inner world, enamored by their insights, and blind to the simplicity of life happening around them. The sun still rises, the world still breathes, but their gaze never lifts from their own reflection. Jung's warning was simple yet profound: the mind cannot live by introspection alone. To gaze inward forever is to forget how to look outward, at others, at nature, at love, at the unpredictable dance of existence. A healthy psyche needs dialogue with the world. It needs to feel, to err, to surrender. True self-knowledge is not mastery over the soul but coexistence with it. It is knowing when to listen and when to live, when to reflect and when to act. The soul does not want to be dissected endlessly, it wants to be experienced. There is wisdom in the unknown, beauty in the unexamined, and health in the balance between light and shadow. In the end, the first lesson of Jung's philosophy is not to dive deeper at all costs, but to remember the surface, the sunlight, the laughter, the human world. For those who forget it, introspection becomes isolation, and the mirror of the mind becomes a labyrinth. The light turns inward, dazzling, consuming, and what was meant to illuminate ends up blinding. Because when self-knowledge becomes obsession, it no longer reveals who we are. It only hides us from life itself. Jung's descent. When Carl Gustav Jung severed ties with Sigmund Freud in 1913, it was more than a professional rupture, it was an existential earthquake. For years, Jung had been Freud's heir apparent, the man chosen to carry the torch of psychoanalysis. But the deeper he ventured into the architecture of the mind, the more he realized Freud's map was incomplete. Beneath the personal unconscious, the storehouse of individual memories and repressions, Jung sensed a far older, deeper realm, a collective layer filled with symbols, myths, and ancient energies that belonged to all humankind. And to prove this world existed, he would have to enter it himself. Thus began what Jung would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a descent so intense that it nearly shattered his sanity. He withdrew from the social world, halted his clinical practice, and allowed himself to fall inward. The years that followed were not filled with research papers or lectures, but with visions, dreams, and dialogues with figures that lived only within him. He wrote everything down, images, voices, intuitions, not to control them, but to understand their language. What emerged became the Red Book, an illuminated manuscript unlike anything in modern psychology, half revelation, half madness. Its pages are filled with crimson ink and dreamlike paintings, serpents, gods, deserts, palaces, and spirits, the living theater of Jung's soul. He didn't observe these visions as a detached scientist, he lived them as a participant. He spoke with his soul as if she were another being, argued with prophets, confronted demons. The barrier between reality and imagination grew perilously thin. There were nights when Jung no longer knew if what he saw was real or delusion. He feared for his sanity. "I felt myself menaced by a psychosis," he later wrote. "The spirit of the depths had taken me." Yet, paradoxically, he continued. He understood that if he fled from these images, they would rule him from the shadows. Only by facing them consciously could he hope to integrate them. This confrontation revealed the hidden architecture of the psyche, what Jung would call the archetypes, universal forces that shape human experience. The mother, the hero, the trickster, the shadow, all lived inside him as ancient presences. He realized that the unconscious was not a passive archive of memories, but an active intelligence, a living cosmos of symbols and energies that could overwhelm the ego at any moment. To awaken these powers without preparation was to risk being devoured by them. And that is precisely what Jung nearly endured. At times he felt possessed by the very archetypes he was trying to study. His dreams bled into waking life. He saw rivers of blood flooding Europe years before the First World War began. He conversed with a mysterious figure named Philemon, a wise, bearded guide who appeared in visions to teach him truths beyond reason. To Jung, Philemon was not just a figment of imagination but a living representation of wisdom itself, a teacher from the deeper layers of the psyche. This inner odyssey left Jung forever changed. He had reached the edge of what a human mind could endure without breaking. But from this crucible, his greatest insights were born. He saw that true healing did not come from domination of the unconscious but from dialogue with it, a sacred exchange between reason and instinct, daylight and shadow. He called this lifelong process individuation, the gradual integration of all opposing forces within the psyche into a coherent whole. Yet Jung also knew how easily this process could go wrong. In those years of solitude, he experienced the peril of what he would later name ego inflation. When one touches the vastness of the collective unconscious, that ocean of myth and divinity, there is a dangerous temptation to identify with it, to feel chosen, enlightened, superior. The ego swells, believing itself to be divine. Jung recognized that this is how mystics lose themselves, how prophets turn into tyrants, and how seekers of wisdom become prisoners of their own revelations. When he finally emerged from that dark passage, Jung returned not as a triumphant explorer but as a humbled survivor. He had seen the gods within, and knew they could destroy a man as easily as they could inspire him. From that point on, his message to students and patients was clear: the unconscious must never be approached with arrogance. It is a sacred power that demands humility and balance. He once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." But he had done the opposite. He had faced his soul and barely survived. Out of that ordeal rose the foundation of analytical psychology, not born of academic theory, but of lived experience. Jung's descent was both a warning and a revelation. The mind's depths are real, but so are their dangers. Self-knowledge can lead to wisdom or to madness. The outcome depends not on how far one goes, but whether one can still find the way back. Because the greatest test of diving into darkness is not what you discover. It's whether you return carrying light. The ego crowned. When Jung coined the term ego inflation, he wasn't describing ordinary arrogance or vanity. He was speaking of a far deeper, more insidious distortion, a psychological illusion born when the human ego comes face to face with archetypal forces and begins to mistake borrowed light for its own radiance. In that moment, the self-explorer, the dream interpreter, the spiritual seeker, begins to believe they are something more than human, a vessel of revelation, a chosen one. This phenomenon often begins with sincerity. A person embarks on a journey of self-discovery, confronting dreams, symbols, and memories that reveal astonishing truths. They begin to glimpse patterns in their own psyche, echoes of mythic figures, hints of timeless wisdom. For a time, it feels as though the entire cosmos is whispering through them. But soon, the whisper becomes a voice that says, "You are special. You see what others cannot." That is the moment when self-knowledge becomes self-deception, when humility is replaced by a subtle intoxication. Jung watched this transformation happen not only in his patients but in himself. He saw how easily one could become possessed by the images of the unconscious, identifying with the archetypes instead of integrating them. Someone who glimpses the wise old man within might begin to act as if they are that figure, dispensing unsolicited truths to others, speaking with the certainty of an oracle. Another who touches the healer archetype begins to feel responsible for saving everyone they meet. The ego expands, but this expansion is hollow, a balloon filled with divine air but tied to fragile string. He wrote of those who emerge from spiritual or psychological awakening with shining eyes and grandiose claims. They use the language of transformation, shadow work, energy, integration, archetype, synchronicity, yet live in constant performance. They speak of authenticity but cannot laugh at themselves. They analyze others endlessly but avoid their own discomfort. Behind the aura of depth hides a hunger for validation. The inflation feels like power, but it is actually fragility dressed as enlightenment. The modern world provides fertile ground for this delusion. Social media, self-help movements, and pop psychology cultures reward performance of insight. People broadcast their inner journeys to prove they are evolving. Yet Jung would have seen this as the unconscious masquerading as consciousness, the shadow dressing itself in spiritual robes. It is no coincidence that those most vocal about ego death are often those most enslaved by the need to be seen as awakened. True transformation, Jung believed, cannot occur without humility and groundedness. When the ego identifies with the archetype, it ceases to serve life and begins to serve itself. The person becomes disconnected from ordinary humanity, from the laughter of friends, the sting of failure, the unpredictability of love. They retreat into abstraction, speaking in symbols while forgetting how to feel. Jung compared this to being possessed by the gods. The individual loses their boundaries, believing themselves to be the instrument of a cosmic will. But the unconscious, he warned, tolerates no arrogance. Those who inflate inevitably fall. Imagine a psychologist who begins to see every patient not as a person but as a symbol in their private mythology. Or a seeker who replaces all emotion with explanation, describing sorrow as a lesson from the shadow, instead of allowing themselves to weep. They no longer live, they interpret. Their vocabulary expands while their soul contracts. Every experience is filtered through theory until life itself feels sterile. Jung called this the greatest spiritual danger, when the mind becomes so full of meaning that there is no space left to live. The inflated ego cannot love, because love demands equality. It cannot listen, because listening requires doubt. It cannot grow, because growth demands humility, the willingness to be wrong, to be ordinary, to be small again. And yet this smallness is precisely where the sacred lives. Jung understood that the divine reveals itself not in exalted self-images but in the cracks of imperfection, in the humble acceptance of one's limits. He often told his students that every revelation must be followed by an act of grounding. Cook a meal. Tend a garden. Pay a bill. The greater the vision, the more ordinary the task required to anchor it. That is how one prevents the inflation from consuming them. Without this return to simplicity, insight becomes theater, a beautiful mask concealing spiritual emptiness. Jung's own brush with inflation left him deeply cautious. After his visionary period, he withdrew from public life for a time, grounding himself in family, work, and ordinary conversation. He understood that to carry light, one must touch the earth. Those who live only in the heights of consciousness risk burning themselves in their own brightness. Ego inflation, then, is not a failure of intelligence but a failure of balance. It is the tragedy of those who, in reaching for the divine, forget their humanity. They crown the ego instead of integrating it, mistaking self-knowledge for self-deification. The prison of reflection. At first, self-reflection feels like power. It gives shape to confusion, order to chaos. To understand why we feel what we feel seems to promise freedom. Yet, as Jung observed, there comes a moment when this reflection turns into its own cage, a place where the self watches itself endlessly, and living gives way to observation. What began as liberation becomes surveillance. The mind becomes both prisoner and warden of its own private cell. This is the realm of hyper-reflection, the silent paralysis that follows excessive self-knowledge. The individual no longer moves freely through life but examines each movement as though it were a specimen under glass. Every word is dissected before being spoken, every emotion weighed, every desire questioned. Is this authentic? Is this my shadow? Is this ego? And while the questions multiply, life itself quietly slips away. Jung described such souls as pathological self-observers, trapped in what he called the watchtower of consciousness. From that high vantage point, they monitor their own hearts with perfect precision and perfect distance. They no longer experience feelings, they analyze them. They don't live moments, they interpret them. Each joy becomes a hypothesis, each sorrow a case study. The warmth of being alive turns into the cold satisfaction of comprehension. This condition often masquerades as wisdom. To outsiders, the hyper-reflective person appears calm, centered, even enlightened. But beneath the surface lies a numbness so deep it borders on despair. They have replaced the unpredictability of emotion with the comfort of control. Every decision must be justified, every instinct domesticated. The spontaneous gesture, the laugh, the impulsive act of love, the mistake, become suspect, dangerous, unrefined. They forget that being human is not a state to be mastered but an experience to be lived. Jung warned that the psyche cannot remain in constant illumination. Total consciousness, he wrote, is unbearable. The human mind requires shadow, zones of mystery, forgetfulness, and instinct. Without them, thought consumes itself. In hyper-reflection, thinking becomes a devouring process. The intellect feeds on emotion until nothing but abstraction remains. The soul becomes a room with the lights always on, bright, sterile, and lifeless. The tragedy is that this state often begins with noble intentions. People seek to understand their pain, to heal, to grow. They begin journaling, analyzing, meditating, all healthy acts, in moderation. But then the habit deepens. Each insight demands another. Each discovery opens a new corridor of meaning. Soon, they are no longer healing but excavating endlessly, terrified of missing a hidden cause. They become perfectionists of awareness, unable to rest until every corner of the mind is mapped. But the psyche is not a territory to be conquered, it is an ocean. The more one tries to drain it, the less one can sail upon it. Jung likened this to a man who stares so long into the mirror that he forgets the world behind him. His reflection becomes his only companion. He no longer knows the texture of rain, the warmth of a handshake, the chaos of laughter. Every sensation must be catalogued before it is felt. Eventually, he ceases to live in the world and lives instead in the commentary about the world, a ghost haunting his own consciousness. This overexposure to the light of awareness has real consequences. Creativity fades, relationships flatten, curiosity dies. The person becomes emotionally sterile, afraid of both pleasure and pain. Even love is examined until it loses its pulse. The more they think about living, the less they live. Yet Jung did not condemn reflection itself, he sought to restore its balance. He believed that the mind must alternate between knowing and forgetting, between control and surrender. Consciousness should illuminate experience, not replace it. The soul, he said, does not want to be understood, but lived. To live it means to risk, to fail, to feel, to step beyond analysis into direct contact with the unpredictable pulse of existence. The way out of the prison is paradoxically simple. One must stop trying to escape it through more understanding. The walls dissolve the moment one dares to act without certainty, to love without perfect insight, to err without explanation. In that leap, the sterile observer becomes a participant again. The psyche, once suffocated by scrutiny, begins to breathe. Because freedom, Jung realized, is not achieved by knowing every secret of the soul. It is achieved by trusting that the soul can live without constant supervision. In a world obsessed with clarity, he offered a quiet rebellion. Leave some corners of yourself unlit, so that life may still surprise you. The wisdom of mystery. By the end of his long and perilous journey, Carl Gustav Jung reached a conclusion that defied the modern hunger for absolute understanding. Self-knowledge is not the summit of life, it is merely the path that leads back to it. To know oneself, he said, is essential. But to know oneself too well is to risk suffocating the mystery that makes us human. There must always remain something ungraspable within us, something sacred, spontaneous, and beyond the reach of intellect. In a century that worshipped analysis, Jung dared to say that the psyche must not be fully exposed to the light. The soul, he believed, needs its shadows as much as it needs consciousness. Too much clarity sterilizes, too much self-examination drains the color from existence. What truly keeps us alive is not what we understand, but what we cannot. It is the mystery that nourishes creativity, love, and faith. Jung wrote that the unconscious is not merely a pit of forgotten memories or repressed trauma, it is a living field of symbols, an ocean of meanings that cannot be reduced to words. When we try to dissect it entirely, we kill what makes it vibrant. The soul, he said, does not want to be dissected but to be touched. That is why he warned that the modern obsession with introspection, personality tests, archetype charts, endless journaling, risks transforming people into curators of their own psyches instead of participants in life. They catalog their emotions, trace their patterns, name their fears, yet forget to feel, act, and live. The mystery Jung defended was not ignorance, it was reverence. He believed that the deepest parts of us should not be explained, but lived through experience. Dreams, love, intuition, art, grief, these are not puzzles to be solved but languages of the soul to be spoken fluently, with awe. When everything must be understood, nothing can be sacred. He often reflected that consciousness without mystery becomes tyranny. When we demand to know every reason behind our feelings, when we seek meaning behind every event, we imprison ourselves in analysis. Life loses its spontaneity, we begin to live only through categories. Yet the essence of existence lies in unpredictability, in the kiss we did not expect, the tear we cannot explain, the silence that comforts more than words. These are moments that belong not to understanding but to being. For Jung, true maturity meant learning to coexist with the unknown. To walk beside one's shadow without trying to erase it. To accept that there are depths within us that will never be mapped. In his later writings, he spoke of holding the tension of opposites, of living between knowing and mystery, reason and faith, clarity and wonder. It is this balance, he said, that makes the psyche whole. And yet, Jung never turned away from life's ordinary ground. He knew that the purpose of all reflection is not transcendence, but participation, to bring awareness into love, work, art, and relationship. The privilege of a lifetime, he wrote, is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you are is not about constant excavation. It is about presence. About showing up to the world with all its contradictions and allowing yourself to be moved by it. He warned that self-knowledge without action becomes a golden cage, a place where one knows every pattern but cannot dance. People spend years identifying their traumas, naming their archetypes, tracing their ancestors' wounds, yet they forget to laugh, to forgive, to cook a meal for someone they love. Wisdom, Jung said, is not the amount of knowledge you carry but the amount of life you can hold with grace. At the end of his life, Jung was often asked what the goal of individuation truly was. His answer was deceptively simple: to live the mystery. To live consciously, yet humbly. To use knowledge as a lamp, not as a floodlight. To act, even when unsure. To let parts of the soul remain unspoken, because in those depths lies imagination, the eternal spark that renews us. In a world obsessed with explanation, Jung offered the most radical idea of all, that the soul thrives not in certainty, but in wonder. The task is not to master yourself, but to dwell in yourself with reverence. Because life, in the end, is not an equation to solve. It is a mystery to inhabit. And those who accept its darkness will see its light more clearly than anyone who tries to control it.